We're going to be going over the first 6 verses this morning, and as we're working through the book of James and making connections and studying not only this section of text, but connecting other scriptures to it this morning. So James chapter 5, verses 1 through 6 is where we're going to be spending our time this morning. And as usual, before we open up our Bible class this morning, I'm going to ask Brother Jack, would you mind opening us up in a prayer to start the class?
Dear Father God in heaven, we're thankful, Father, for this day and this life. We thank you, Father, for this opportunity to come and study your word, Father. We pray that everything we say and do will be in accordance with your word. In Jesus' name we pray.
Amen. Thank you very much. So yes, we're in James chapter 5, and we're going to be making connections and working through this text together this morning. I want to go and just start by reading through reading through our text this morning. James chapter 5, verses 1 through 6. James writes, "Come now, you rich, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches have rotted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have corroded, and their corrosion will be evidence against you, and will eat your flesh like fire. You have laid up treasure in the last days. Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you have kept back by fraud, are crying out against you. And the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived on the earth in luxury and in self-indulgence. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the righteous person. He does not resist you." So here we're continuing on in the book of James, and if you remember last time, I know that was about 2 or 3 weeks ago when we last studied James together, but we were beginning to already look at a subject of wealth, and we were talking about the arrogance of wealth previously. This time we're looking at what seems to be a very clear and strict warning about wealth itself. What are the dangers that can come from focusing and putting our time and our energies into wealth? Now, a few things to think about as we're going through and continuing on in the book of James. Again, James is a book that seems to be very much following the structure and pattern of wisdom literature, especially the book of Proverbs. Every little section seems to be a nugget of wisdom, and not only that, it seems to be building off of some other teaching that has already been taught. And I think we've made the case for all of these nuggets of wisdom James is giving us. All of these are being built off of teachings that Jesus has already given. And if you notice in verse 3, again, he has this very specific phrase, "You have laid up treasure in the last days," which calls us back immediately, or at least it calls my mind back to what Jesus said back in Matthew chapter 6. Let's go ahead and turn and look there. I think we already know where we're going with this, but let's look at what Jesus said anyway. Matthew chapter 6. Can I get a volunteer to read Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 through 21? When you got it, just start reading. Matthew 6, 19 through 21. When you got it, start reading, please.
Don't store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves don't break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also.
Thank you, Kevin. So here in this context here, this is in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus is teaching to people who want to be his disciples, and again, he drops this wisdom upon them. And he's talking about laying up your treasures in heaven. But what's interesting is, as we look and study our passage in James this morning, it's very clear that the connection, how James seems to be building off of Jesus' teaching. But not only that, notice what Jesus says here. He lays the foundation, don't lay up for yourself treasure in heaven. And what is the reason he seems to give? Is that if you're putting your treasure here on earth, instead of putting your treasure here in heaven, earth treasure is perishable. It can be stolen. It can be moth-eaten. It can rust. It can be destroyed over time. It does not last forever. Versus the treasure that we can have in heaven can be eternal. It cannot just be broken into and stolen. It does not pass away with time. It does not rust. It is eternal. It does not perish. And so we have this contrast between earthly treasure and heavenly treasure. And then Jesus ends his teaching by saying that wherever your treasure is, that's where your heart is also. When we go back to James, if you would turn back with me, I want us to notice that at first glance, James is not only building off of Jesus' teaching, but it also seems that James is showing us the result of what it looks like for someone who puts their treasure here on earth. Let's read our section again. Here James chapter 5, verse 1 again. Come now, you rich, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you. Again, this idea of misery, of strife that is to be coming your way. It's to be coming in the future. Verse 2, your riches have rotted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Exactly what Jesus just said would happen if our treasure is here on earth. Do not place your treasure in heaven where it can be stolen, where it can become moth-eaten, where it can rust and be destroyed. And James is showing us full circle, that is what has happened for someone who has put their treasure here on earth. Again, it's the full circle. James is showing us the result of what it looks like when we do put our trust and we put our treasure here on earth. Verse 3, elaborating some more. Your gold and your silver, they've corroded. And their corrosion, not only have they corroded, but they will be evidence against you and will eat your flesh like fire. You have laid up treasure in the last days. Again, James is building off of teaching that Jesus has already given, and it seems to be coming full circle here with seeing what happens when we put our treasure in heaven. Now, personally, in preparing for Bible class this morning and studying up on this, I never quite made the connection how you have the, if you will, the before and the after here. Jesus is teaching, here's what you need to be doing, but if you make the wrong choice, this is what it looks like afterwards if you do that. Any thoughts on, yeah, Bruce?
Well, a few years after James wrote this, the Jewish aristocracy, all the elites, were almost obliterated in the overthrow of Jerusalem. In fact, of the 1.1 million people that they think that died in that Roman Jewish war, almost all the rich Jews were behind the walls for protection. And they were some of the people that starved, even though they had gold and silver and so forth. And I was trying to parody the phrase where it says, and it shall eat your flesh. Because there were people that resorted to cannibalism in the walls of Jerusalem because they were cut off by the Romans without anything to eat. So just like I said, just a few years after this, these rich men were decimated.
Yeah, it's actually a very interesting comment you make there too about historically this is happening, and you have some people resorting to cannibalism because they're just so hungry. Times like that, war and starvation, they either bring out the best or the worst of people, and so we see these evil things happening. But I don't even know, how close to the history that is. It's very possible and likely even that happened. But notice something James said even back in chapter 4. Look back with me, James 4, verses 1 through 3. Again, when we got to this section before, we were talking about what kind of heart do you have. But notice what James says in the first 3 verses of chapter 4. What causes quarrels and what causes fights among you? Is it not this, that your passions are at war within you? You desire and you do not have, so you murder. You covet and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask wrongly to spend it on your passions. You adulterous people, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. I'm going to stop there. Again, the purpose of this section of text was to look at where is your heart? Are you a friend of God or are you a friend of the world? But notice how even in the midst of that conversation, James is already making some connection that when our hearts are not right, that can result in us having conflict and pretty intense, even violent conflict with each other. When our hearts are not right, we tend to act terribly to each other at times. And so, again, whether that happened or not, in the Jews' history with the destruction of Jerusalem and what's happening, again, it's all on theme with what James is talking about here. When our hearts are not right, when our focus is wrong, when we're focused on the riches of the world, and that's where our passions are, rather than our passions being in God, that can cause us to treat each other very horribly. And so that's something that seems to harmonize there together. A good thought. Going back to James 5, 1 through 6, making connection to James building off of Jesus' teaching. Did anybody else have any other thoughts or observations anybody wanted to mention? Okay, let's look James 5, going back to verse 4, and we'll work through the second half of this text. Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, are crying out against you. And the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived on the earth in luxury and in self-indulgence. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the righteous person. He does not resist you. Again, we talk about, if you look back at James 1, verse 1, back in verse 1 again, we have the introduction to the letter. James, the servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes in the dispersion. Again, James is an elder of the church in Jerusalem. And a lot of his teaching seemed to be catered more towards a Jewish audience. Not that every single Christian in Jerusalem were all Jews, but certainly James's message is going to resonate most with the Jews. A lot of what he says, he's building off of things Jesus has already said. The Jews were hearing Jesus in person. Also, a lot of the imagery he uses, a lot of imagery that Jews grew up with in their culture for a very long time. And again, this imagery here, James is using of the wages of the laborers and someone keeping back what they are owed and keeping it back by fraud. That's something we can read about back in the Old Testament. Turn with me to Deuteronomy 24. Turn back with me to Deuteronomy 24. I'm reading Deuteronomy 24, I'm reading verses 14 and 15. Again, Deuteronomy is a book where God is essentially very clearly laying out a whole bunch of different aspects of the law which the Jews were to lay out. But in Deuteronomy 24, verses 14 and 15, it is written, You shall not oppress a hired worker who is poor and needy, whether he is one of your brothers or one of the sojourners who are in your land within your towns. You shall give him his wages on the same day, before the sun sets, for he is poor and counts on it, lest he cry out against you to the Lord and you be guilty of sin. Again, going back to James is using this imagery of someone who is taking the wages that someone has worked hard for, and I'm going to hold that back. I'll pay you later. But he's building off of something the Jews would be very familiar with according to the law of Moses already. As we just read back in the law of Moses, don't keep back the wages of the worker. Give it to them that day because they are dependent upon that, lest they cry out to the Lord against you. And what we're seeing here by James, again, if your treasure's here on earth, and you're being horrible to these people, you're holding back, you're holding on to your wages here, even though you got the work out of them, it's fraud, as James calls it. And you're holding back the fruit of the laborers from those who work in your fields here.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
In fact, it was a sin under the old law to hold on somebody's wages overnight. Because you got to remember, these people worked all day. They bought their food on the way home because there was no refrigeration. All right? So they had to work during the day, buy their food on the way home, and eat then. There was no saving money or saving food or whatever. And it was a sin. I think it's pointed out in Leviticus 19, in Jeremiah 22, and Malachi 3:5.
Yeah, and also not to mention, we just read it itself. It said it's considered sin to hold back.
It was considered a grave sin to do that.
Which that begs the question, why is that sin? As of God. Why would holding back the wages of a day's work from someone when they're dependent upon them, why would that be considered sin? It's stealing. And I'm sorry, Russ, what did you say? You're harming them as well. Again, when we talk about the law and we're looking back at what are the specific laws God gave, what we need to learn to do, a lot of times we go through the law and we just think to ourselves, okay, so these are all the strict rules that God gave. But the reason God gave this is for us to see what kind of person is God teaching his people to be through that. When someone is going to hold back the wages that someone has worked hard for all day, you're not only stealing, as we pointed out, and you're harming them, God is teaching us, don't be that kind of person. Don't be someone who is not a respecter of other people, and you're going to be hurting them for your own benefit and stealing from them. You're hurting them, you're harming them by acting shamefully against these people and doing so. And God's law is teaching them back in the Old Testament, and again, we're seeing it building off of that here. God is teaching us not to be that kind of person. Give them what they're owed. Be good to them. Russell, do you have a thought?
You see that today. People do not get rich by giving away their money. And in fact, they go through an extreme sometimes so that they want to look like they're virtuous, so they have this philanthropy, and they build up these organizations to give away portions of their money. But realistically, they're doing no good with that. If they had given a fair wage to the people that work for them, they actually got them their company to where it was in the first place, that would have been a better way to practice philanthropy and be virtuous. So anyway, I've seen that, especially in corporate America, you see that. You see CEOs making millions of dollars. These people, and I don't know, I do know political, but it goes back to the Old Testament. I mean, they were doing it then, they do it now. They'll do it after I'm home dead.
Yeah.
So,
Just like Brother Russ pointed out, nothing under the sun. This is not something new. I saw Charlie's hand first, and then we'll come back to Bruce.
If I remember correctly, in 1969, when I began teaching here, they kept my first check 6 weeks before I could get any money.
Oh man, under the law of Moses, they're in trouble. Bruce?
Yeah, back in chapter 4, where it says, what is causing a fight among you? Well, this is one of the things that was causing the fight.
Again, because their heart's not right.
Right. They were holding on to the poor people's work day money, and that was causing a really, really big fight.
Yeah. Absolutely. Again, look, just as Brother Bruce is pointing out to us again, looking back at chapter 4, again, the whole section of the text we looked at, we made the observation again, where what we're really looking at is the heart. Is your heart right or is it wrong? And when your heart is wrong, what can be the consequence of some of that? We treat each other horribly. This is another manifestation of that, which if you're rich, you can be a very real temptation for you to treat other people horribly because your heart's not right. Your treasure's here on earth. It's perishable. And yet, again, look, considering the whole of what James is talking about here, where does that happen? Your clothes are moth-eaten. It's rotted. It's corroded. Sister Gigi.
It does that if you're withholding funds, money from somebody who's worked for it. You're also allowing, they could be tempted to sin because, now they don't have the money that they actually worked for, and so they might go to, where they wouldn't have, stolen something, now they might look to doing that. So there's a temptation there that you face.
Yeah, another good observation too, when we wrong others, we also give them opportunities to sin as well. Again, that is not to say that we are responsible for each other's sin. Ezekiel 18:20 is very clear about that. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon himself, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon himself. Sin doesn't get passed around, but also righteousness doesn't get passed around either. But that can motivate us either positively or negatively, whether we are righteous towards someone else or we are also acting wickedly towards them as well. That can motivate each other both ways. And so that's another good observation. Again, going back to chapter 4 again, what is the cause of all these quarrels and fights among you? Your heart's not right. And that's causing you, to treat each other horribly. And now another manifestation of that. Any other thoughts on that? All good comments this morning. Sister Carol.
I just wanted to notice some repetitive phrases, like in chapter 2, and someone comes in among yourself with riches and gold and silver, the garments. And then in chapter 5 is another look at the kind of garments to help us see with the spiritual eyes. It's not just with the physical eyes, because your garments are moth-eaten. You think they're this, but this is what they really look like. They're corroded with gold and silver. This is what it really looks like. It's corrupted. You think you're maybe in the wages that you're holding back, that you're treasuring, you're adding up the interest and making profit off the wages you're holding back. But you're laying up for yourself treasures in the day of wrath. Those kind of things are coming. This is what you're going to read. Romans 2 talks about that. So there's repetitive language to help us see with eyes that are spiritually, not just look at the value of what we think is there, but to see real value.
Yeah, I really appreciate Sister Carol's comment as well. Again, there's so much imagery in the Bible about what you're wearing and how do you look, how are you presented to the people, but really what's on the inside. You think back to the Old Testament. I don't have the scriptures off the top of my head, but before Agnes and I went away for a few weeks, we did a lesson on looking back at some Old Testament roles, and we looked at the priests, and one of the things we commented on was the special clothing the priests were to wear. Why are these priests supposed to wear these special clothing? Why are they supposed to be made a certain way? Because priests are supposed to look different. They're not supposed to look like the common person. And as we take that role and apply that to ourselves in the New Testament, because the New Testament teaches that we are priests now for God, again, that same application is to apply to us. Again, what does your clothing look like? We go to the book of Revelation, and I forget which congregation he tells it to, but you have soiled your garments. Again, this language of your clothing and really what does it look like on the inside and the appearance of it? Is it moth-eaten? Is it destroyed? Or is it in the case of Revelation, is it soiled? That's important. It's symbolically very important to God, and it's an image that's used all throughout the scriptures. And something else Sister Carol pointed out, again, touching on verse 3, their corrosion will be evidence against you and will eat your flesh like fire. What you look like to God, it's either going to help you or it's going to hurt you. And so how do we make sure that we're doing what we're supposed to be doing, that we can remain clean and not soil our garments in the case, again, as in Revelation? Charlie, did you have another thought surrounding that?
Yes, and in this time in the world, clothing was very, very labor intensive. Our clothing's made, the thread is spun by machines almost instantly. The cloth is woven by machines. They can fill this auditorium with the cloth they make at one factory in one day. And sewing machines then sew it together. It's no big thing today, but back then you spun the thread out of the wool and the cloth. Then it had to be put in a loom and hand woven. It was a disaster to lose your clothing.
Yeah, the whole process too, even just to get it clean itself. I'll get thoughts. Any other thoughts on anything we talked about so far before we touch on anything else?
Well, the one thing is that you could always tell the difference between a poor and a rich man.
Yeah.
Because the poor wore the same clothing every day. They didn't have to change the clothes.
Yes.
Rich men would spend a lot of money for adornments and so forth, and they could change their clothing. So it was very obvious to the eye the difference between the rich and the poor.
And not only that, when you have someone that is rich or someone that's notable, and then now suddenly they're wearing clothing that doesn't match their status, that's also very eye-catching as well. That makes me immediately think of when Jesus washes the feet of the disciples. The text tells us that he lays aside his garments, he takes a towel, wraps it around himself, and he begins washing their feet. But again, Jesus, he's taken again off his clothing, he's lowering himself in literally every single respect to wash their feet, to serve them. When someone of higher status also lowers themselves in the way they look as well, again, it goes along with that idea as well. Any last thoughts on that? You trying to get my attention, Ted? Oh, there we go. I was wondering about that. Anyways, we're here in James 5, 1 through 6. Okay. Let's look at make another connection to another text here. Luke chapter 6. In Luke chapter 6, we have recorded here for us a series of woes that Jesus gives, but they're all related to our subject matter of our text here in James this morning. James chapter 6, can I get someone to read verses 24 through 26? Anyone? I'm sorry? Yes. Luke chapter 6, verses 24 through 26. Someone to read those.
But woe to you who are rich, for you have received your comfort already. Woe to you who are well satisfied with food, now for you will be hungry. Woe to you who laugh, now for you will mourn and weep. Woe to you when all people speak well of you, for their ancestors did the same thing with the false prophets.
So we talked about laying your treasures in heaven versus laying your treasures on earth. Again, I think in a very real way, James's teaching also builds off of Jesus' teaching here about these woes. The point of these woes that Jesus is giving is that, good for you. You got this. This is what you're going to have to look forward to in the future. You're going to be hungry again. Good for you. You got food. You're going to be hungry again. You're rich. Good for you. You received your comfort already. Woe to you, laugh now, because you're going to mourn and weep later. Woe to you when people speak well of you. That's your reward. But also notice that your fathers did the same thing, except they did that also with the false prophets. Jesus has a very real way here with these woes of humbling these things we may give our heart to, these treasures we may store up for ourselves in heaven. And James building off that again. Look at all these things you build up for yourself. Now they're corroded. They're moth-eaten. Building off of the same idea that Jesus taught, recorded for us here in Luke. Any other? Yes, Sister Gigi.
It's just interesting that it's in that order. And I think it's because when you're well fed, it's actually harder to think that you might be hungry. It's harder to go from being a good thing to a bad thing.
Yeah, well, using the same analogy though too, for someone who's well fed all the time, when they're hungry, I'm struggling right now because I'm not used to being hungry like this. But for some, yeah.
That's why it says woe to you, because either you're going to be faithful in both areas, or you're going to have a hard time. So,
Yeah.
I think it's harder, and that's why it says woe to you who are well fed now, because your trial is coming. And that we all, through every season, we have our ups and downs and our trials. We kind of think on the fact that, okay, we have our job, we're saving money, and we have all these things. So, it'll be grand until I die. And no, that's not how it works. There is going to be, and when you get comfort, like in a comfort zone, you kind of don't see it coming sometimes. And that's where you can really fall.
Absolutely.
Well, in Luke 19, along with Gigi's thought, Luke 19:42 through 44, it says, if thou hadst known, even though, at least in this day, the things which belong unto thy peace, but now they are hid from thine eyes. For the day shall come upon thee, that thine enemies shall cast a trench about thee, and compass thee round, and keep thee in on every side. In fact, the things that are coming to us because of our sins are hidden from us because of our good feelings at the time. We feel so good that our rational thought is really ruined. And that's what emotion can do to us.
Yeah.
We get so emotional about a thing that we don't think rationally. And Christ is saying that those things are hid from us that are on their way.
Yeah, that's certainly another observation we make from our human existence, and certainly that is true in some respects. And we need to be aware of that, and knowing that we can be blind, and it can be dangerous for us to be locked in on what's happening right in front of us. Any other thoughts on any passage we've looked at so far before we look at some others? Another passage that came to mind when preparing and studying this passage, Luke 12. We looked at this a few weeks ago when we were talking about the arrogance of wealth, but I think, again, it's very applicable here again. Luke 12, 16 through 21. We have the parable of the rich fool. I'm going to start reading in verse 13. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Man, who made me a judge or arbitrator over you?" And he said to them, "Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions." And he told them a parable, saying, "The land of a rich man produced plentifully. And he thought to himself, 'What shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops.' And he said, I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry. But God said to him, Fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich towards God. Again, at the heart of everything we're looking at, and the heart of the text that we're looking at in James, built upon Jesus' teaching, another part of Jesus' teaching here, where is your treasure? Is it on earth or is it in heaven? That is the central principle. And when we put our treasure on earth, look, it's perishable. It can be destroyed. It'll rust. It'll pass away. It can be stolen by time. But also when our treasure is there and we think about how do I increase that, and that's where our heart is, again, we get something here, just like the parable Jesus gives. What is that going to do for you? Your soul is required of you now. What did that benefit you? You have to give it all up now, and you don't get to take it with you. Why build up your treasure on earth? Instead, rather, build up your treasure in heaven. Become rich towards God instead. The contrast between being rich here on earth and being rich towards God and having our treasure in heaven. It's a very predominant idea here surrounding all these passages. Any other thoughts surrounding the parable here? One other observation in my studies and prep for this class, and then after that, I'm out of prepared material. We can talk about anything else in the book of James that maybe we want to touch on again. Turn with me to 1 Timothy chapter 5. So we look at this text here of James' text and talking about putting your treasure in heaven versus on earth. And we talk about, if your treasure's on earth, it's perishable, it'll pass away. And notice, I'm gonna read through it again real quick, but James puts a little bit of emphasis here as well on living in self-indulgence. I'm reading verse 5. He says, "You've lived on earth in luxury and in self-indulgence. You have fattened your hearts in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the righteous person. He does not resist you." Again, that's the heart that James is talking about here, and he's trying to correct here. Something else I want to observe here in 1 Timothy chapter 5 and for us to think about, talking about the widows, look at verse 3 through 8 with me. Here in this section of 1 Timothy, this is where Paul is giving Timothy the instructions of when is the church to take care of widows. 1 Timothy 5 verse 3, "Honor widows who are truly widows. But if a widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show godliness to their own household and to make some return to their parents, for this is pleasing in the sight of God. She who is truly a widow, left all alone, has her hope set on God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. But she who is self-indulgent is dead even while she lives. Command these things as well, so that they may be without reproach. But if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for the members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever." Notice here in this text, talking about honoring widows and taking care of them and when to put them on the roll and to take care of them. Notice here, Paul takes some time to talk about the widow who is truly relying upon God versus one who is living, again, in self-indulgence. He's talking about taking care of widows who they really don't have anybody to take care of them. They don't have any immediate family there with them to take care of them, but they are true believers in God. They're trusting in Him. They're living day to day, setting her hope on God and continuing in supplication and prayers night and day. But he contrasts that with the one who is self-indulgent, saying that she is dead even while she lives. It's interesting to note that when we're looking at helping people and people who are truly reliant on God, contrasting that from those who are they're just going to be profiting off of the work of others and not having to do anything, living self-indulgent lives rather than the one who is truly focused on God. God, you are my provider, and I don't know how you're going to provide, but I have my faith, I have my trust in you. I think that really demonstrates very well some of the other themes we've seen throughout James and will continue to see as we go throughout the rest of the book. Again, where is your heart? Is it in your earthly treasure, or is it in earth? Is it in God, or is it in something else that you rely upon to be sustained, to be taken care of? And even in the midst of, again, looking at the widows, again, there's this contrast made between the ones who are really trusting and hope and putting their hope in God, rather than those who are just going to sit back and let everybody else do the work for them and just think they're taken care of, instead of redirecting her hope and trust in God. Another observation. Any thoughts on the connection there? And yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Who is he talking about here supporting these widows?
Let me go back to the text I turned away from. So who is he talking about as far as taking care of these widows? Let's see. Let me find the specific words he uses. He starts by talking about honoring, or I'll just work through the text here. We didn't read the whole section of it, so there's also more to be talked about in verses 9 through 16. But let's just work through it real quick. Verse 3, honor widows who are truly widows. Verse 4, if the widow has children or grandchildren, let these first learn to show godliness to their household and to make some return to the parents, for this is pleasing. She who is truly a widow. Verse 6, she who is self-indulgent is dead. Command these things. So there's already a command for those who are related to this widow. If she has children or grandchildren, they are first to learn to show godliness to her. And then we jump down to verse 9. We didn't read this before, but let's go through verse 9. Let a widow be enrolled if she is not less than 60 years of age, having been the wife of one husband, and having a reputation for good works. If she has brought up children, has shown hospitality, has washed the feet of the saints, has cared for the afflicted, and has devoted herself to every good work, but refused to enroll younger widows, for when their passions draw them away from Christ, they desire to marry, and so incur condemnation for having abandoned their former faith. Besides that, they learn to be idlers, going about from house to house, and not only idlers, but also gossips and busybodies, saying what they should not. So I would have the younger widows marry, bear children, manage their households, and give the adversary no occasion for slander. For some have already strayed after Satan. If any believing woman has relatives who are widows, let her care for them. Let the church not be burdened, so that it may care for those who are truly widows. So what we have described here seems to be the church has the authority from God to take care of widows who are truly widows. But there's a few qualifications here first. First, if they have any immediate family, if they have children, grandchildren, family that can take care of them, they are first responsible to take care of these widows. And so that's the instruction given here. But then there's a contrast as you have a widow, she doesn't have an immediate family. It seems that she can put on some sort of role, and the church can now take care of this widow here. Does that answer your question, Alan? That seems to be from this text what we can gather regarding your question. If they have family, their responsibility first to take care, so that the church would not be burdened. But if she doesn't have that family near, or a family to take care of them, then she can be put on some role, and the church can take care of her. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, and also, if she doesn't have family that can take care of her, the church still cannot take care of her if she doesn't qualify as verse 9 there.
Exactly, yeah. So that's what we see here in this passage.
What was the last phrase? If she doesn't qualify as what?
If she doesn't meet these qualifications that we just read about. So we have verse 9, Paul says, let a widow be enrolled if she is not less than 60 years of age. So again, she's got to be at least 60 or older, so that's a qualification. So Alan's comment was just saying, we have some other qualifications mentioned here, and if she doesn't fit these qualifications, then she is not to be put on the roll as in to be taken care of by the church in the same way. The church has very specific instructions and qualifications for widows that can be put on this roll, and that's just what Brother Alan was pointing out to us. So. Jay, did you have a thought or a question?
I have a thought. The rule of being 60 sounds rather arbitrary, and to what extent do we take a phrase like that in the Bible and make it really an unbreakable dogma that we won't help a widow if she's 58 years old? I don't care what her condition is.
Yeah, Kevin, you want to answer that?
Well, the way I look at verse 9 is, for example, we support you as a preacher, and so you're kind of on the roll. And so a woman or a widow who is 6 years or older can actually be put on kind of like a payroll to support them. we're still obligated as a church, because how can you say somebody who's struggling, we can support them, but a widow who's not 60 years old, sorry, we can't do that. No, we're still obligated to support a needy Christian in a time of need, widow or not. But I think this is more of a permanent status in verse 9. Put them on the roll. We can permanently, support them if possible.
Yeah, the manner of support here seems different than just regular support. From what I understand, it's the difference between giving someone a gift. Hey, I know you're going through a hard time, and so I'm going to give you this to help you because I know you're going through this hard time. Versus a permanence, like Kevin talked about. So where do all of our funds go? So this person gets this much for this reason, and this person we've dedicated this person who is on the roll, and we've dedicated this amount of our. I'm sorry. Similar, yeah. Jim.
So that case, you're talking like a permanent regular paycheck.
Yeah. But again, this permanence of this support here, it seems to be given, again, specific instructions only with these qualifications. Not that we can't help them if they're less than 60. That's... I think your original question was, to what point do we get so strict about, the exact age and stuff? Again, the scriptures we're reading other people's mail. And so when we're trying to be pleasing to God, we have examples. We try to follow those examples as best we can because we want to be pleasing to God. But we also recognize, situationally, we're in different situations today a little bit. And so, we're supposed to be learning from the scriptures, what kind of people does God want us to be? God in the scriptures teaches us we are to be helping each other, taking care of each other in the church. And so again, just because you have a widow and perhaps she's younger than 60, that doesn't mean you don't help her. But what Paul is talking about here is the specific manner of help. She's not to receive this kind of help unless she meets these qualifications. Not that you're not supposed to help her at all. And so, as far as the direct application of all this, again, it takes some discerning to know, what are the scriptures teaching, but also to hear Paul for what he's trying to communicate to Timothy. And what he was communicating to Timothy was about this specific situation of when to enroll. And it seems that it was relevant in their day. And so Paul was giving him instruction on that. And so certainly, it's a good exercise always for us to be studying and to learn the principles. What is God teaching us to be, and how do we try to be that as faithfully as we can? So, any other thoughts or comments or anything anybody wants to bring up? We have 2 minutes left of class.
Well, age would have to be relative because during those days, 2,000 years ago, the average age was around about 35 to maybe 45. So 60 was very old. And if you look at relative to today, 60 is not that old. So to hold that number would be almost at a disadvantage for helping somebody in this case. If we were to hold it to 60.
Yeah. Again, their situations, that's the qualification to give. So for them, if that's what Paul says, I would assume that Timothy would be teaching that and emphasizing that to them as well. But there is a little bit, again, the context is slightly different. 60 then is, again, like you said, a harder age to achieve than it is today. But certainly, again, this is the instruction we give, and what are the principles to follow. So, any other last thoughts for this last minute of class? All right, we'll end it there. Thanks for your comments and questions.